Folk horror. A genre where ancient beliefs, rural isolation, and the horrors of tradition collide to create unnerving atmospheric terror. From the windswept moors of England to the dark woods of Appalachia, folk horror thrives wherever old legends refuse to die. But how did folk horror emerge? And how does it manifest across different cultures? Join me as we explore folk horror around the world. Before 1900, folk horror primarily existed in the realm of oral folklore and literary works, with stories often drawing from pagan beliefs, rural superstitions, and the unsettling aspects of nature. Featuring elements like witches, shape-shifting creatures, and vengeful spirits, particularly in cultures across Europe and beyond. Notable examples include the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, ancient myths like those of the Greek gods, and works by authors like M.R. James, where rural settings and unsettling supernatural elements were prominent. Stories of witchcraft, spectral black dogs, and cursed moors inspired generations of horror writers, most famously M.R. James and Arthur Machen, whose eerie tales of forgotten rituals still haunt us today. Key examples of pre-1900 folk horror include The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. It is considered a seminal work of folk horror, featuring a mysterious ancient deity in a rural setting. Another important work includes Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by M.R. James. This is a collection of chilling tales often set in old houses and rural locations. This body of work, 33 supernatural tales in all, was published in one volume as Collected Ghost Stories in 1931, with a focus on the psychological dread of the supernatural. One of my favourites is The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood, a story exploring the concept of a malevolent spirit tied to the wilderness and greed. Eerie and unsettling. Some of the themes and elements found in early folk horror works include rural isolation. Stories often took place in remote villages or forests, where the community was cut off from the outside world. Pagan rituals and beliefs, incorporating elements of ancient practices, like sacrifices, magic, and appeasement of spirits. The uncanny and the unknown, a sense of unease arising from the familiarity of the rural landscape, combined with the unsettling presence of the supernatural. Nature as a malevolent force, the forest or wild landscape often portrayed as a dangerous and potentially hostile entity. The cultural influences included the witchcraft trials and their historical accounts of witch hunts that contributed to the portrayal of malevolent witches in folklore. Folklore traditions of stories passed down through generations included tales of local spirits, mythical creatures, and ominous legends. The superstitions and folklore offered a vast catalogue of folk horror tropes. The classic folk horror movement began in the United Kingdom in the 1960s and 70s, with what film critics call the unholy trinity of folk horror. Witchfinder General, 1968, a grim tale of religious persecution during England's Civil War. Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971, a story of an evil force taking root in a rural village, warping its people into something monstrous. The Wicker Man, 1973, perhaps the most famous folk horror film, featuring pagan rituals, human sacrifice, and the clash between modern Christianity and ancient nature-based traditions. We will take an in-depth look at the unholy trinity in a future video, as well as one of my favourite books and videos, Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon, a book that has a similarity to The Wicker Man. The 1970s miniseries did a fair job of bringing the book to the screen. It could use a revision to the big screen if any producer is watching. But as mentioned before, folk horror existed long before cinema. The English countryside has always been ripe with ghost stories, pagan folklore, and dark superstitions. And the West Country specifically is home to its own wonderful folklore, with the moors and the quaint villages of old. Travel north, and we find Scandinavian folk horror, where the landscape itself is a force of terror. In these icy lands, ancient Norse legends, pagan gods and sinister folklore linger in the deep forests. the huldra, a beautiful forest spirit who lures men to their doom. The Draugr, a vengeful undead Viking who rises from the grave. The Nekken, mysterious figure who plays haunting music near rivers, drawing victims into the water. Modern films like Midsummer, 2019, and The Ritual, 2017, explore this unsettling connection between folklore, isolation, and supernatural dread. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a different kind of folk horror thrives, one rooted in ghost stories, witchcraft, and the isolation of rural life. Here, Scots-Irish settlers brought ancient European beliefs that merged with Native American legends and local superstitions. Tales of haunted hollers, vengeful spirits, and backwoods curses spread through oral storytelling passed down for generations. The Bell Witch of Tennessee, a terrifying poltergeist that tormented a family in the early 1800s. The Brown Mountain Lights, strange, ghostly orbs floating above the mountains with no scientific explanation. Legends of skinwalkers and cryptids blending Native American folklore with modern fear. Folk horror in Appalachia often focuses on the horrors of isolation, where the outside world doesn't reach, and old traditions still hold power. Folk horror is not just a Western phenomenon. It thrives wherever ancient traditions and modern fears collide. In Japan, ghostly folklore merges with natural landscapes, from the haunted forests of Aokigahara to the vengeful spirits of Onryo. In South America, the legend of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, blurs the line between myth and reality, haunting rivers and lakes. In Africa, the Tokoloshe, a mischievous and deadly spirit, brings terror to those who dare defy ancestral beliefs. These stories all share a common thread: the fear of what is old, what is hidden, and what refuses to die. Folk horror terrifies us because it feels ancient. It taps into our deepest fears, the ones buried in our history, our cultures, and the places we call home. It reminds us that we are never truly alone. That in the quiet countryside, in the dense forests, in the hidden places of the world, something old still lingers. And maybe, just maybe, it's watching us. If you love folk horror, hit that like button. Subscribe for more eerie tales and let me know. What's your favourite folk horror legend? Drop it in the comments below.